for coming, everybody. I don't have much to say, but I just felt compelled to just say a few sentences. My grandfather was a great man, the greatest man I've ever known. He was an honest-to-God war hero, and probably already know that, but he sacrificed more for this country than I think anybody here can even fathom. He was the greatest fisherman I've ever known, which, if you know anything about my family, that's kind of a big deal. And I know some damn good fishermen. He was the best. But most importantly, he was the most generous, kind father, grandfather, great-grandfather, uncle, brother, person that I've ever known. So I love you, Grandpa. I'll miss you.
For those who don't know, my name is Tom Berzik, and I'm Joe's nephew. And the family has granted me the honor of giving Joe's eulogy because in the past years I spent a lot of time with Joe and had wide-ranging talks with him. And so it's an honor to be able to give this remembrance of him. But in addition, because I also not only over the years talked with Joe about very many things, but also spent a lot of time with him in his last weeks and days and in fact hours. I think that I'm also obliged to speak for Joe and give some messages to his family that he would have wanted me to give. So I'll combine those comments here. The art critic Hilton Kramer once said about modern art that he really had a hard time seeing a picture, by which he meant understanding a picture, if he didn't know the theory behind it. And I think that's true, I think, of people too. We see Joe, for instance, as Lynn's son just said, we see him as a kind man, we see him as a generous man, we see him as a reliable man. But that doesn't tell us anything about their motivations in being that, or their convictions, or the strength and depth of those convictions. And I think that it's difficult, in fact, for us to see Joe in that fullness because of our modern conception of ourselves, which he didn't share. That is, the modern conception that we have of ourselves is one, you might want to call it we believe we've somewhat liberated ourselves, and we very much are against the idea that we just occupy certain roles in life because we feel that can stereotype us and it unfairly defines us in too narrow a way. Certainly there's some validity in that idea. But from the times that Joe came from, and certainly the theory that Joe adopted, I think, from a very young age, was quite different. They fully accepted the idea that you lived your life occupying certain roles, and you tried to do those roles proud, and you accepted the discipline of those roles, and the idea of how you lived a virtuous and a good life was that you lived up to the ideals of those roles. That's a very different conception than we have today, I think. So it makes it hard for us to kind of see Joe in all his fullness. I think that because he didn't see things the way we see things, he avoided what seems to me to be the two pitfalls of our modern conception of how we view ourselves and others. Number one, it seems to me, a lot of the pitfall of seeing ourselves as kind of everyman or in every different role is that obviously we only have limited amount of energies, psychic and physical and otherwise, to devote to things. And any attempt to try to be too much and can lead to the problem, I think, of somebody ending up not really have been much at all of anything. And this is something that I think Joe's conception of life very much saved him from. Because if you consider his life in full, I think one of the most startling aspects of it when you go through the history of the roles that Joe occupied, is not only can you say that he never failed at any, not only can you say that he succeeded at them all, but I think that you can say he excelled at them all, and I think I'll demonstrate that in my further speaking. In addition, I think perhaps paradoxically, the modern conception that we have of ourselves is can lead, while we think we're so broad, and certainly things like the internet, mass communications, all the modern things that life has given us that were not in existence when Joe was born in 1918, can lead to a certain immodesty on our part, in the sense that we believe we're so smart now, we know so many things, that it can lead to a certain kind of smallness and even pettiness on our part. And I think that, again, I think Joe's very different conception of things, how he saw himself and other people, saved him from that to the point in which it was not just a matter of him not being small or petty, was a matter in which he repressed in himself. But it was really utterly absent and foreign to his very nature. I saw him quite a bit over the last years, and we sat and talked about a lot of things. We never talked about anything small or petty. It was entirely foreign to his nature. And I think that's why anybody talking about Joe sensed that there was this kind of, this was a fundamental organic aspect of Joe. It wasn't just that he was a nice guy offhand and that was part of his kind of persona that he put on. That was very organic and fundamental to him. Now, of course, anybody who says that they live their life within a certain kind of seeing themselves in certain roles, kind of, the suspicion is that this is a narrow person, perhaps an unintelligent person kind of thing. Let me assure you that the difficulty for me, very quickly after talking with Joe, was trying to understand how this man, this unlettered man, could be so intelligent and so knowledgeable at so many different things. We talked about things from aardvarks to zebras, and he always seemed to know something about the subjects that we talked about. And it mystified me that this exceedingly intelligent man, and I've had the privilege of associating with a lot of intelligent people in my life, and Joe was as intelligent as any of them, until I finally arrived, I think, at the solution to how he got that way. Because he had not only the gift of intelligence, and there's a lot of intelligent people these days, he also had the more rare gift of having a very keen academic or intellectual imagination, whereby if he knew or was given certain facts about something, he was very readily able to deduce from that, well, if that's true, well, then this must be true. And if they know that, then this also they must know. And the consequences from that, and the deductions that could lead from that. It was a very rare thing to see, and it was very acute with Joe. He was a very smart man, he was a very deductive man, and it was really stood out in terms of anybody talking with him. In terms of demonstrating, I think, that the method of Joe's approach to life, as occupying certain roles, both voluntary and involuntary, and how he did in those. I think the first role that he occupied was one of an athlete. I think that academics came so easily to him in high school that it didn't present any challenge. They certainly had no gifted and talented program at the time, which he certainly would have been in. And so the first challenge was athletics, as many young men go into. And we see the pattern start right from the start, because what happened at the end of his high school career, but that he's offered, of course, an athletic scholarship to go to college with that. He turned that down. He became not just a mechanic, but a diesel mechanic for large-scale diesels. And of course, the pattern then starts to establish itself. Very shortly, he's told by the Army, for example, No, you're wasting your time being a diesel mechanic. You must teach diesel mechanics to other people. What happened then was, again, they said very shortly, well, you're wasting your time at that. And he was handpicked to get into the Army Air Corps program. And the fact is that the rate of people who they thought were eligible for that and that they tested, it was probably upwards of a 90% washout rate. So yet again, there's a role that Joe is not only sitting there, he doesn't fail, he not only succeeds at, but he's doing brilliantly at. I think everybody knows that he ultimately was an infantryman, and that's only because the Army found itself in a surplus of pilots and an absence of infantrymen as the war in Europe went on. And so Joe went to France, of course, as a staff sergeant, and once again we see that same pattern reestablish itself. He goes there as a staff sergeant, and what happens is he emerges as he gets a battlefield promotion to a lieutenancy. Now, it was interesting because the paperwork of that never actually came through because he was wounded before that came through. And he was never interested in pursuing getting that paperwork from the Army or pursuing that. And it's interesting because, again, with that kind of keen intelligence that he had, he didn't see that as being really a mark of his success or how he did as a soldier in that role that he played as a soldier. And of course, you don't play that role much when you're talking about the lethal consequences that come from failing at that. He didn't really see that lieutenancy as mattering because to him it was not a matter, and he was never a man, surprisingly, he knew his own mind enough. He was never over-impressed with things like rank or degrees or titles or those kind of things. He was a worldly enough man and comfortable enough in his own intelligence that was not the kind of thing I think that he saw that it should be judged on in terms of how he did his soldiering. Instead, I think, if you want to ask how Joe did as a soldier, I think you should look at the documented fact, that in the specific campaign that he was in, for a person of his rank, the average life expectancy of a person such as Joe was 17 days. Joe emerged after 75 days in combat, wounded. After he recovered from that, the next role that he assumed, obviously, was husband to Martha, and then father to the 3 children. And in terms of getting into how he did in those roles, let me first say this. I think there is somewhat of a confining nature to the idea of living your life as Joe did in certain roles, because it means that you accept a certain discipline of the logic of the role. It has certain kind of values and codes of conduct, etc. And so, for instance, it wouldn't surprise me at all in terms of addressing his children that Joe probably wasn't the most effusive father in the world. But you have to remember, Joe saw his role as a father. What do fathers do? They protect. They provide. In a word, they give strength. And so, if it were to come to the idea of slobbering over your children, telling them how much he loved you, that was somewhat at odds with the idea. The basic idea of fatherhood. It looked like it may have diminished the idea of the strength that he was to provide. So I think that you have to recognize that and know that no father ever loved his children the way Joe loved you. He would want me to say that, and I want you to understand that.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
But there's more also, too, because there's something that you gave to him. Just as Joe believed that life was lived in terms of roles, and a successful, virtuous life was lived by doing those roles proud, he believed that not only of himself, believed that of other people, too. And so, no father also could have been more proud of his children than Joe was of each and every one of you